Hey friends, this is Pastor Joe from Southwest Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I'm here today with a discipleship recap from our message this past Sunday, June 9th, when we talked about Deuteronomy chapter 28 and a development in the church's history that we often don't think about, but this is how the church really grew in its beginning from being an urban movement. In the ancient world, the Christian church was centered on cities. And over time, it grew to kind of encompass the whole land, the city and the countryside both. And this is really interesting for us because as we think about the church today in America, we often have kind of the opposite impression that the church is really something that's strong in the countryside, in rural areas, and not so much in the city. So we're thinking about all of that. And first, some history that's, I think, really worth noticing is that the Christian church did start as an urban movement. Of course, it started in Jerusalem, and then as Christians spread out through the book of Acts, and then after the time of the book of Acts, they didn't just, march in a straight line from Jerusalem to somewhere else. They traveled between centers of population, between cities. Right? So from Jerusalem, they went to places like Caesarea Maritima. They went to places, cities in the Greek-speaking parts of the empire, places like Ephesus. Paul, of course, went to places like Athens and traveled around. They went to these centers of population because that's where you could find synagogues, for one, where they could tell Jewish believers the good news that the Messiah had come. His name was Jesus. And that's also where you could find crowds in marketplaces and things like that, so that those early Christians could share the good news with lots of people at once. And it was an urban movement. And the Christian church really remained an urban movement, at least through the first few hundred years of its existence. Even in the 4th century, when we find Bibles being translated into Gothic languages, when they wanted to talk about pagans, that is, people who are not Christians, unbelievers, they used the word heathen, which means someone from the heath, someone from the countryside, someone from the wild and untamed parts of the land. Because in cities, we have cathedrals, we have pastors and priests and bishops. Out there in the countryside is where the pagans are. That's kind of the way they thought, right? So, of course, we contrast that with our American context, where we feel very often, like Christianity is especially strong in the rural parts of the country. And we heard some statistics. Christianity is somewhat stronger, but even when we looked at information from the American Communities Project, when they looked at big cities, they found that about 63% of people in big cities said they were Christian. And you contrast that with rural parts of America, and they had a number of different sort of rural, smaller town types of communities they looked at. But on average, it was about 80% of rural Americans call themselves Christian. And so this is a difference, of course, from 63 to 80%. But it's only about a 15% difference, 16, 17% difference. So it's not like there's no Christians in the cities and they're all out in the countryside. And of course, if you go and walk around the cities, you realize this. There's lots of churches there. And of course, there's lots of people there. And even we can say, since the population is concentrated in cities, there's probably at least as many Christians in American cities as there are in the countryside. So we can't really say that cities aren't Christian in America. What they are is they're places where things change much more quickly. And that's always been true of cities. That's why Christianity took a foothold in the cities in the ancient world, because they were places where things could change quickly. Now, for us, coming from a context where we used to live in a Christian society and we're very quickly moving away from a Christian society, I think that's why cities sometimes get a bad rap with Christians, is because they're places where things change quickly. And of course, as people turn away from the Christian faith to other expressions of spirituality and religion, cities tend to be where you find it happening. So what does all this mean? Well, like I said, we read from Deuteronomy chapter 28. where we heard the blessings of Moses, the blessings that God would give to Moses to share with his people, and the blessings they would receive for obeying the Lord faithfully, responding in faith to what God had already done for them. And those blessings, Moses says, and God says, I'm going to bless you in the city and the countryside. I'm going to bless your homes. I'm going to bless your places of agriculture. I'm going to bless your places of work. And what we see is that God's going to bless us for faithfulness. He's going to let it be known that we are his people and we rightly bear his name when we live faithfully as his people. And this is true no matter where we're at. So, can the blessing of God come in the countryside? Absolutely. Can the blessing of God come in the city? Absolutely. What do we do with this? Well, on Sunday we talked a little bit about how in our mental maps of the world there are places where we think we don't go there, right? Or we think of places, it could be a city, it could be a particular block, or even a particular home or establishment, a place of business, where we think that God's redemptive work is just not going to happen because something about the people there. Maybe they have a different religion, maybe it's the kind of work they do, maybe it's the kind of social causes they support, and we just say to ourselves, Jesus is not going to make a difference there. What I hear Jesus saying when we talk about God's blessing coming upon his faithful people, wherever they're at, what I hear Jesus saying is, there's no place where his redeeming work cannot be done. And there's no place where Christians should not trust the Lord to care for them and their needs. There's no place where Christians should not think that Jesus can make a difference there and perform his saving work in people's hearts to bring them to faith and to lead them to baptism and life in the church. It may look very different in different situations, but that's always been true. And the Christian faith has always been translated by Christians faithfully in the new contexts. And I think, what was really compelling for me to think about was many of the places where we might look and say, wow, that place is off limits. I don't think Jesus is doing his work there. Well, there's other Christians who call those places home, right? So we should always trust the Lord to do his work and to be willing to follow him wherever he's leading us or wherever he shows us there's someone in need. We can go and do good things there to share the love of Christ, to share the word of Christ, both law and gospel, grace and forgiveness all together, right? So that's what I get. What do you hear from Deuteronomy chapter 28? I think it was verses 1 to 14, but the first part of that chapter where we heard the blessings of God for those who keep the law faithfully. And what is Jesus saying to you about how you put that into practice in your life today? Throw that in the comments below. I'd love to have a conversation. Until next time, take care and God bless.